found this inside. I found this inside.
No. What time did you leave?
9:30.
Who stayed? Noah. An honest woman is being pushed out. I'll make some calls.
Who are these people?
People who still believe in some things.
At 2:17 in the morning, Eleanor Whitmore woke up believing she had heard thunder. 30 seconds later, she realized her father's workshop was burning to the ground. The sky above Whitmore Ranch glowed orange against the darkness of the Texas plains. Flames rose high enough to illuminate the entire property. Smoke poured into the night air, carrying with it the smell of burning wood, leather, oil, and memories. Eleanor ran barefoot onto the porch. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The workshop. Her father's workshop. The building William Whitmore had built with his own hands over 40 years earlier. The place where he had repaired saddles, restored wagons, taught young ranch hands, and spent countless evenings with his grandson Noah. It was gone, or at least it soon would be. "Eleanor!" one of the ranch hands shouted. "Stay back!" But she didn't listen. She ran toward the flames. Around her, employees were already fighting the fire with hoses and water tanks. Horses in nearby stables screamed in panic. Trucks arrived from neighboring ranches. The entire property had become chaos. Then she heard Noah crying. The 8-year-old boy stood near the fence, clutching a half-finished leather saddle. The saddle he had been restoring for months. The saddle his grandfather had once used. "Grandpa's saddle," Noah whispered through tears. "It's still inside." Eleanor dropped to her knees and pulled him close. "I'm sorry," she whispered. It wasn't enough. Nothing could have been enough. 20 minutes later, the sheriff arrived. He surveyed the scene. Old electrical wiring, dry wood, strong wind, an accident. That's what everyone believed. Everyone except one man. As firefighters continued battling the flames, another pickup truck pulled onto the property. Jacob Miller stepped out. Beside him was Emma. She ran immediately toward Noah. Jacob didn't. He didn't look at the fire. He didn't look at the smoke. And he didn't look at the crowd. Instead, he looked at the ground, slowly, carefully, the way only someone trained to notice what others miss would. He walked toward the northern fence, stopped. Kneeling in the mud, he studied something nobody else had seen. Tire tracks. Fresh ones, too fresh. Then he noticed the smell, not smoke, not burned wood, fuel. His eyes moved again, 10 feet away, a footprint, partially hidden beneath the wet grass. Someone had been there, someone who wasn't supposed to be. Behind him, firefighters continued fighting the blaze. The sheriff continued calling it an accident. The town continued watching the fire. But Jacob Miller wasn't watching the flames anymore. Because while everyone else was looking at what had burned, he had already begun searching for the person who lit the match. To most people in Texas, Eleanor Whitmore was one thing: a billionaire, the owner of the largest ranch in the region, the daughter of a legend, a woman powerful enough to influence elections, markets, and entire communities. But as Jacob Miller stood in front of the burning remains of the Whitmore Ranch workshop, watching Eleanor hold her crying son beneath the glow of the dying flames, he realized something most people never had. Eleanor Whitmore wasn't protecting a business. She was protecting her father, or at least everything he had left behind. Long before the Whitmore name became synonymous with wealth, William Whitmore had been exactly what Jacob was now: a rancher, a father, a man who built things with his own hands because he couldn't afford to pay someone else to do it. The workshop had been the first building William constructed after inheriting the ranch from his own father. At the time, the Whitmore family had money problems: droughts, failed cattle seasons, bank loans. People who now spoke about William Whitmore as though he had always been powerful had forgotten that there was a time when he had almost lost everything. But William never sold. He never quit. Instead, he built. He built fences. He built barns. He built relationships. And eventually, he built an empire. But of everything he ever built, the workshop remained his favorite. Because unlike the mansions, the offices, or the business deals, the workshop had never belonged to the billionaire. It had belonged to the cowboy. Employees still talked about how William would disappear there for hours. He repaired saddles himself, restored antique wagons, sharpened tools, taught young ranch hands how to repair leather, and whenever Noah visited, William treated him exactly as he had treated everyone else, not as an heir, as a grandson. The workshop had become something larger than a building. It had become memory, which explained why Eleanor had looked as though she had lost her father all over again while watching it burn. After William died, Eleanor inherited everything: the land, the cattle, the businesses, the investments, the responsibility, and the enemies. Because wealth attracts admiration, but inheritance attracts resentment. Some believed she was too emotional. Others believed she was too young. Many believed she was too compassionate to survive in a world built by ruthless men. And there were those who believed something even worse: that eventually she would break, that eventually she would sell, that eventually someone else would own what William Whitmore had spent his life protecting. Jacob knew exactly what that felt like. He wasn't a billionaire. He didn't own thousands of acres. His ranch was small. His debts were large. And every month felt like a negotiation with bad luck. But grief doesn't care about money. Loss doesn't care about status. And protecting your family feels exactly the same whether you own 100 acres or 100,000. He understood Eleanor because he had lived his own version of her pain. After Sarah died, people had offered advice: sell the ranch, move to the city, start over, think about yourself. But Jacob never could, because every fence Sarah had painted, every horse Emma loved, every piece of land beneath his boots held memory, and memory is the one thing people fight hardest to protect. The fire continued burning for hours. By sunrise, almost nothing remained. The workshop that William Whitmore had built with his own hands had become a field of ash, twisted metal, and broken stone. Investigators walked through the debris. The sheriff continued speaking about electrical failures. Insurance agents began arriving. Employees stood together in silence. Nobody noticed that Jacob Miller had disappeared, not because he had left, because he had begun searching. He walked around the perimeter of the burned building. Twice, then 3 times, examining tire tracks, studying footprints, watching faces, old habits, the kind that never really disappear. Emma sat quietly beside Noah near one of the horse corrals. For the first time since arriving, neither child spoke. Eventually, Noah stood. He wiped his eyes. Then he walked toward Jacob. In his hands was a small piece of burned wood. "Dad said you notice things," Noah said quietly. Jacob knelt. "What is it?" Noah handed him the charred fragment. "I found it inside." At first, Jacob saw nothing unusual, just burned wood. Then he turned it toward the morning light, and his heart stopped. There, barely visible beneath the soot, a mark, not a brand, not a repair stamp, a symbol, one he hadn't seen in years, one he had hoped he would never see again. For a moment, the sounds of the ranch disappeared. The firefighters, the deputies, the employees, everything. Because Jacob Miller suddenly understood something terrifying. The fire had never been about destroying a workshop. It had been about destroying whatever that symbol represented. And somewhere nearby, someone already knew that Jacob had recognized it. Jacob Miller never raised his voice. He didn't accuse anyone, he didn't threaten anyone, and he certainly didn't make speeches. While the rest of Whitmore Ranch mourned what had been lost, Jacob did what he had always done when something didn't make sense. He started asking questions, not the kind of questions people expected, not who, not why, not yet. First, he wanted to understand how. The fire investigators continued examining the ruins. Insurance agents walked through the property carrying clipboards. Employees gathered in small groups, trying to make sense of what had happened. And through it all, Jacob remained quiet. That worried Eleanor more than anger would have. She had only known Jacob for a few months, but she had already learned something important about him. The quieter he became, the more dangerous the situation usually was. The first person Jacob spoke to was the night foreman. "What time did you leave the workshop?" he asked. 9:30. Who was still there? Noah. Anyone else? The man hesitated. A delivery truck. Jacob looked up. What delivery? The foreman frowned. I don't know. It left before I could ask. Jacob nodded. No reaction, no surprise, just another piece. The next morning, he drove into town. He visited the fuel station, the supply warehouse, the feed company, the hardware store, and everywhere he went, he heard the same thing. The Whitmore Ranch account had been frozen. Credit requests had been denied. Long-term suppliers had suddenly stopped extending payment deadlines. At first, nobody questioned it. After all, rumors spread quickly in Texas, and during the previous month, one rumor had spread faster than all the others. Whitmore Ranch was collapsing. Jacob heard it at the diner, at the gas station, at the livestock auction. Everyone had heard some version of the same story. Eleanor Whitmore was preparing to sell. The ranch was drowning in debt. Investors were pulling out. Employees would soon lose their jobs. The strange thing wasn't that the rumors existed. The strange thing was how perfectly organized they were. Rumors don't usually arrive all at once. Fear does. Someone had created that fear. Someone had carefully prepared the ground long before the fire ever started. By the third day, Jacob had filled an entire notebook. Supplier cancellations, anonymous phone calls, delayed shipments, lost contracts, canceled insurance reviews. Every event by itself looked ordinary. Together, they looked like a campaign designed to weaken Eleanor Whitmore, a campaign designed to isolate her, a campaign designed to make one thing happen: a sale. Late that evening, Jacob sat alone in his workshop. Emma had already fallen asleep. The old notebook rested on the table beside him. Outside, the Texas wind pushed softly against the windows, and for the first time in years, Jacob Miller allowed himself to think like the man he used to be, not the father, not the rancher, the investigator. The truth was, there had been a time when people across Texas knew his name, not because he owned land, not because he had money, because when something impossible happened, they called Jacob Miller before Emma, before Sarah became sick, before he buried the badge and tried to become someone else. Jacob had been a Texas Ranger, not the kind from television, the real kind, the kind that spent years hunting men who believed they were smarter than the law, the kind who learned that criminals rarely begin with violence. They begin with preparation. The best crimes are committed months before anyone realizes a crime exists. And suddenly, everything made sense. The rumors, the suppliers, the credit refusals, the anonymous calls. The fire wasn't the beginning. The fire was the final step. Someone had spent months preparing to destroy Eleanor Whitmore, not because they hated her, because they wanted what she owned. Jacob opened the notebook again. He circled one name, a name he had tried very hard not to write: Victor Kane, investor, business rival, neighbor, and a man who had spent years trying to acquire portions of Whitmore land, a man who had recently made Eleanor several offers, a man who had become unusually interested in purchasing the property after William Whitmore died. Jacob stared at the name for a very long time. Then he reached into an old drawer, beneath unpaid bills, beneath repair receipts, beneath photographs of Sarah. There was something he hadn't touched in years, an old leather address book. He turned the pages slowly until he found the number. He looked at the clock, 11:42 p.m. Too late for ordinary people, not too late for the man he needed. Jacob picked up the phone. The line rang twice. A tired voice answered. "Hello?" Jacob remained silent for a moment, because some conversations change your life the moment they begin. Finally, he spoke. "Tom." The old man on the other end didn't answer immediately. He recognized the voice after all these years. "Jacob?" Jacob looked out the window toward the darkness surrounding his ranch, toward Emma sleeping safely inside, toward the distant lights of Whitmore Ranch, and then he said the words that would change everything. An honest woman is being pushed out of what her father built. On the other end of the line, retired Sheriff Tom Harrison didn't ask a single question, because he already knew exactly what that sentence meant. and because 20 years earlier, when Ranger Jacob Miller called you in the middle of the night, someone very dangerous had usually made a very big mistake. The first truck arrived at 6:13 in the morning. Eleanor Whitmore noticed it because almost nobody visited Whitmore Ranch that early anymore. Not after the fire, not after the rumors, not after everyone had started believing that the ranch was finished. She stood on the porch of the main house holding a cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. The sun had barely risen. The burned remains of her father's workshop still smoked in the distance, and a single dusty pickup truck was slowly making its way down the long gravel road. She didn't recognize the driver, an older man, gray beard, weathered hat, the kind of face that had spent decades under the Texas sun. He parked near the ruins, stepped out, and without saying a single word, began helping ranch workers clear debris. 10 minutes later, another truck arrived, then another, and another. By 8 o'clock, more than 20 vehicles had entered Whitmore Ranch. Former sheriffs, retired mechanics, ranchers from neighboring counties, veterans, horse trainers, old investigators, men and women Eleanor had never met, people who apparently knew exactly where to go and exactly what to do. No one asked for payment, no one asked for permission, they simply started working. Some brought tools, some brought food, others brought records, files, and laptops. One elderly mechanic climbed onto the remains of the workshop roof and began cataloging damaged equipment. A retired county clerk set up a folding table and started reviewing property records. 2 former deputies positioned themselves near the entrance gate, not to intimidate anyone, to protect the people inside. Eleanor found Jacob near the horse barns. He was repairing a broken fence post, as though 30 strangers hadn't just appeared because of a phone call he had made. "Who are these people?" she asked. Jacob looked up. "Friends." She laughed. "No. Seriously." He smiled. "People who still believe some things are worth protecting." For the first time since the fire, Eleanor didn't feel alone. By midday, she began hearing stories. The retired mechanic had once worked for William Whitmore during a drought that nearly destroyed his ranch. The former sheriff claimed Jacob had saved his life during a manhunt 23 years earlier. One rancher admitted William had secretly paid his mortgage after his wife died. Another revealed that Jacob had spent weeks helping rebuild his barn after a tornado. None of them were there because they owed money. They were there because they owed loyalty. And loyalty, Eleanor was learning, was a currency far more valuable than wealth. The investigation expanded rapidly. The retired county clerk discovered unusual property acquisitions surrounding Whitmore Ranch. The former deputies identified shell companies connected to those purchases. A retired insurance investigator found evidence of repeated claims and suspicious inspections linked to businesses owned by Victor Kane. By the second day, a pattern emerged. Not a theory, a pattern. For nearly 18 months, someone had been preparing to destroy Whitmore Ranch. Anonymous calls had frightened suppliers. Credit lines had been quietly restricted. Business contracts had been manipulated. Land values had been artificially lowered. Rumors had been strategically spread. The fire had never been the plan. The fire had been the final move. The goal had always been the same: make Eleanor desperate, make Whitmore Ranch vulnerable, then buy everything for a fraction of its value, and every road led back to Victor Kane. When Eleanor saw the evidence, she felt physically sick, not because she was surprised, because somewhere deep down, she had known. Victor had spent years pretending to be an ally, advising her father, offering business opportunities, warning about financial risks, all while patiently waiting for the right moment to take everything. But there was still one problem: evidence. They had motives, patterns, witnesses, but they needed proof, real proof, the kind that survives courtrooms, the kind that destroys men like Victor Kane. That evening, Jacob returned to the ruins of the workshop. Everyone else had gone home. The smoke was gone. The silence had returned. He walked through the debris carrying only a flashlight. He wasn't looking for evidence. Not exactly. He was looking for something else, something that had bothered him since the first night. The symbol Noah had found, the one burned into the piece of wood. He searched for nearly an hour. Then he found it. Hidden beneath collapsed beams and melted metal, a small steel lockbox, blackened, burned, but intact. He carried it back to his truck, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to hope. The next morning, the council meeting began. The room was packed. Lawyers, council members, business leaders, Sheriff Harrison, Eleanor, and Victor Kane. Victor looked confident, relaxed, the same way guilty men always look before they realize the truth survived. He smiled when he saw Jacob enter. He stopped smiling when Jacob placed the burned steel lockbox on the table, because at that exact moment, Victor Kane understood something he had believed impossible. The fire hadn't destroyed everything, and whatever survived inside that box was about to destroy him. By the time the emergency council meeting began at Whitmore Ranch, nearly the entire county had already heard the rumors. Some said Eleanor Whitmore was about to lose everything. Others believed Victor Kane had finally won, and a few people still thought the fire had been nothing more than a tragic accident. Only one person in the room knew the truth: Jacob Miller. The meeting was held in the old assembly hall William Whitmore had built decades earlier. Every chair was occupied: council members, attorneys, Sheriff Harrison, business owners, employees, ranchers, reporters. Even families from neighboring towns had come, not because they cared about a burned workshop, because they sensed they were about to witness the end of something much bigger. At the front of the room sat Eleanor. For the first time since her father's death, she looked tired enough to lose. Victor Kane noticed it too. He sat comfortably, confident, relaxed, the perfect expression of a man who believed he had planned everything. He greeted people, shook hands, even smiled at Eleanor, because in his mind the battle was already over. The fire had destroyed the workshop. The rumors had damaged the ranch. The banks were nervous. The suppliers were leaving, and soon Whitmore Ranch would become another business opportunity. Then Jacob Miller walked into the room. He wasn't carrying a briefcase. He wasn't carrying legal documents. He wasn't carrying a speech. He was carrying a burned steel lockbox. For the first time that morning, Victor stopped smiling. The room fell silent. Sheriff Harrison stood. "Mr. Miller," he said, "you requested this hearing." Jacob nodded. Then he placed the lockbox on the table. No dramatic gestures, no anger, no accusations, just the truth. The first evidence was simple: fuel receipts, purchases made under shell companies connected to Victor Kane. Then came the delivery records, anonymous contractors, vehicles entering the area near Whitmore Ranch days before the fire. Then came witness statements, former employees, drivers, contractors, people who had remained silent because they believed nobody would ever listen. Victor shifted in his chair. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable. But Jacob wasn't finished. Next came the security footage, recovered from a backup server that Victor's men never knew existed. The room watched in complete silence as a truck entered the northern section of Whitmore Ranch shortly before the fire. A truck registered to one of Victor Kane's holding companies. Nobody spoke. Then came the bank transfers, the payments, the insurance records, the false contracts, the property acquisition plans, every piece connected to one man: Victor Kane, the businessman who had spent nearly 2 years preparing to destroy Whitmore Ranch from the inside. Victor stood. "This proves nothing." His voice sounded weaker than he intended. Jacob looked at him. Then he slowly opened the lockbox. Inside rested a leather-bound ledger, blackened by smoke, damaged by heat, but intact. The room became perfectly silent. Eleanor's hands began to shake. She recognized it immediately. Her father's handwriting, William Whitmore's private ledger, a book nobody knew existed. Jacob carefully opened the first page. Then he handed it to Eleanor. She read silently, then stopped, then read again. Tears filled her eyes. Sheriff Harrison took the book, then one of the attorneys, then the historians. The conclusion was immediate. William Whitmore had known, not everything, but enough. For years he had documented irregularities, hidden transactions, suspicious contracts, property transfers, false valuations. Every page contained another warning, another concern, another suspicion about Victor Kane. And on the final page, written only weeks before William's death, were the words that destroyed everything Victor had built. If anything happens to Whitmore Ranch after I'm gone, investigate Victor Kane first. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Victor tried. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, because there was nothing left to say. Sheriff Harrison slowly stood. The room watched. After all these years, he still looked exactly like a lawman. "Victor Kane," he said quietly, "you are under investigation for fraud, conspiracy, arson, and criminal coercion." Two deputies approached. Victor looked at Eleanor, then at Jacob, then at the floor. For the first time in his life, there was nobody left to manipulate. As he was escorted from the room, nobody spoke, nobody celebrated, because everyone understood something. The fire had never been about destroying a building. It had been about destroying a family, and it had failed. 3 weeks later, the first construction crews arrived at Whitmore Ranch. Not because insurance paid for them, because people volunteered, ranchers, workers, mechanics, neighbors. The same people Victor believed would abandon Eleanor. Instead, they came to rebuild. Eleanor stood beside the foundation of the new workshop and cried. Not because she had won, because her father had. His workshop was gone, but his legacy wasn't. That afternoon, she found Jacob standing alone near the construction site. She held out a folder. The reward. He didn't even look at it. "You earned it," Jacob smiled. "No." She looked confused. "You saved Whitmore Ranch." He looked toward the new workshop, then toward Emma and Noah. The children were laughing as they carried a small wooden board together. Finally, Jacob spoke. "I didn't save a building." He paused. "I saved the place where a father taught his child never to give up." Eleanor couldn't answer, because she understood. As the sun began to set over Texas, Emma and Noah carried the first wooden plank to the construction crew. The workers stopped. Everyone watched, because everyone understood what that moment meant. A beginning, not an ending. Jacob stood beside Eleanor. Neither of them spoke. They simply watched the children. And as the last light disappeared beyond the horizon, Jacob finally understood something William Whitmore had always known. They thought they were burning down a workshop. What they didn't understand was that some legacies don't die in fire. They rise from the ashes. If someone tried to destroy everything your family built, would you walk away or would you rebuild? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about courage, family, honor, and cowboys who never give up, subscribe to the channel and join us for the next story.